Canada, NATO's Arctic Achilles heel. Justin Trudeau's disastrous neglect. The Ukraine war's destabilizing events have sparked maneuvering between NATO and Russia, a level of tension not seen since the end of the Cold War in 1991. The Baltic region, which has a common land border and sea region with Russia, is considered the main NATO flashpoint. The Arctic region, another potential flashpoint, is increasingly evolving into a strategic area. Similar to the Baltic, NATO countries dominate the Arctic, with 7 of the 8 countries and Russia being the only non-member Arctic country. The 2 countries that share the longest borders in the Arctic are Canada and Russia, and that is a serious problem for NATO. The problem is that Canadian armed forces are in a worrying, unprepared, and atrophied state, making it doubtful that they can provide meaningful deterrence in the region. Therefore, the burden of deterrence in the Arctic will fall on the other 6 NATO countries in the region. The retreat of the ice sheets in the North Pole has opened up regions in the Arctic Circle that were previously impassable by most modes of transportation, even in the summer months, and this issue has significantly impacted both Russian and Canadian maritime operations. Russia maintains the Northern Sea Route, or NSR, and Canada maintains the Northwest Passage, or NWP, with both countries recognizing each other's respective sea routes running through the Arctic, with the result that the Arctic has not been a traditional source of friction. These two routes are located in the Arctic and are the shortest routes to travel between the Pacific and Atlantic Ocean. Ice makes the NSR impassable for long periods, but the NWP has less of a problem with ice. The reduction of ice in the Arctic has opened up potential for improving Russia's NSR navigation. Russia is currently investigating this as it collaborates with China to enhance the NSR's infrastructure, therefore boosting its commercial potential and enabling Russia and China to move military forces between the 2 oceans. The region is also rich in resources for gas, oil, and rare earth minerals. The ice retreat will now allow previously unattainable energy resources to become accessible. The development of these natural resources necessitates the construction of additional infrastructure to harness them in previously inaccessible areas. The Arctic also has military value because it provides the shortest route for missile launches, thereby reducing early warning of attacks. This in turn necessitates the installation of even more early warning radars and position it as a prime location for anti-missile defense systems. People also regard the polar region as an ideal location for launching both north, south, and polar orbits for satellites. NATO, Russia, and China recognize the importance of the Arctic, and NATO has determined that it must have a credible deterrence and presence in the area and not surrender the initiative to Russia and now China. Canada, with the NWP and the longest NATO border in the region, is a key geographic location of the NATO strategy, and it is woefully unprepared for an increased NATO role. The Canadian Armed Forces, under the leadership of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, have seen their readiness decimated by a government that does not see value investing in its armed forces as a priority. The Canadian Armed Forces currently have 71,500 regulars and 30,000 reservists, but that is 16,000 short below the authorized strength. Canada allows permanent residents of non-Canadians to join the military due to the lack of citizens volunteering for the armed forces. This is not unusual for some NATO countries, including the United States, but this has not helped redress the recruiting situation. An exacerbating issue with the recruitment is that it takes 18 to 24 months to complete the application to join the Canadian military, a process that is so cumbersome that 15,000 applicants withdrew their applications largely due to the wait time in 2023. The lack of manpower is not the only problem facing Canadian military. It also faces more serious issues of readiness. All branches of the Canadian military suffer from chronic issues that can only operate at around 50% of their theoretical strength. This means that Canada has limited ability to project any credible fighting force outside its borders and appears much less able to contribute to one of NATO's key locations to defend in the Arctic, which includes within the Canadian border. The chronic underfunding of the military largely drives the Canadian readiness issue. On average, the Canadian government spends about 1.3% of its GDP on the military. It has not spent more than 2% of its GDP since 1989, when it started to decline, like many NATO countries after the end of the Cold War. NATO countries agreed to increase defense spending to at least 2% of GDP because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014. In 2015, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau became Canada's leader, but despite his public support for NATO and this NATO target, Trudeau did not attempt to meet Canada's NATO commitment. NATO members pressed Prime Minister Trudeau about Canada's lack of contribution at the NATO summit in early July in Washington, D.C. Under this pressure, Trudeau stated that Canada will reach the 2% target, but not until 2032. This is an unsatisfactory response that has led provincial politicians in Canada to call for the Trudeau government to reach the 2000 target well before 2032. Despite the calls for increased spending, throwing more money at the Canadian defense sector will not fix the issues with the Canadian readiness. Canada has systemic issues with procurement that the Trudeau administration has not attempted to address, which ensures that Canada will have chronic readiness issues. Even with increased defense budget, the Canadian government is unlikely to spend the money quickly enough to acquire the necessary equipment to improve readiness, let alone effectively add new capabilities, until it implements the reforms in the Canadian military that slow down the ability to procure the military equipment that the Canadian military needs. The most pressing obstacles currently slowing down the procurement began after Canada's withdrawal of all its forces from the NATO mission in Afghanistan in 2011, 3 years ahead of the NATO schedule. The end of Canada's role marked the beginning of the military's decline as a priority as the Canadian government rapidly distanced itself from the war and its armed forces. Cost overruns and political infighting over new programs and oversight, which results in modifications to defense programs authorized in previous defense budgets and currently in the procurement process, are the root causes of the Canadian military procurement issues. This results in program delays and additional cost overruns that, even with increased budgets, this procurement process hinders the efficient and effective allocation of funds towards essential programs and their timely completion. Until the government addresses the budget and procurement processes, increased defense budget will not fix the Canadian readiness issue in the foreseeable future. The Trudeau government exhibits a complacency in addressing the issues pertaining to the Canadian Armed Forces, a complacency that NATO pressure was unable to adequately instill. Despite Canada's long history of maintaining a high-quality military, neither the current nor some of the previous governments have prioritized them, a trend that extends beyond the Trudeau government. Canada has not faced an existential threat in its vast territory, which has contributed to its complacency. It also understands that any existential threat to Canada would also pose a threat to the United States, and Canada can rely on the U.S. to defend both Canada and itself. The opening of larger parts of the Arctic, as well as the erosion of the security situation due to increased tensions with Russia, have put Canada at the forefront of the discussion. If Canada is unwilling to finally address its budget and procurement issues, it will create a security gap for NATO. NATO will either have to accept the risk or contribute more non-Canadian resources to Arctic defense, which includes Canada's vast Arctic territory. The Trudeau government is aware of the Arctic vulnerability and has promised to increase defense spending by $5.9 billion over the next 5 years, with part of it dedicated to Arctic defense, including maritime sensors and new helicopters to help patrol the region. However, these promises of increased spending by the Trudeau government still fall short of surpassing the 2% GDP goal. Furthermore, this additional spending comes without any significant changes to the procurement process. There is a possibility that the new defense spending will lead to more of the same issues that are plaguing the current and last programs, and the readiness of the Canadian Armed Forces will continue to suffer, as will the country's ability to improve the contribution to the NATO Arctic priorities.